Okay, welcome everyone to the Workflow and Orchestration Ask the Expert session. Today we're going to be talking about approvals, specifically how and when to use the workflow approval activities. My name is Russ Sarbora. I'm a member of the automation service, actually now the workflow team. Jesse couldn't be with us today. He's our orchestration component of this discussion, so you just have me today, but it's a workflow topic, so I think we should be good. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to start with an introduction of the workflow and approval engines and basically how they work together. A lot of people think that workflow is approvals or approvals are workflow, and actually they're two different engines, and they're integrated together via a set of approval activities. And so we're going to go a little bit over how that mechanism works, and then I'll run through the different approval activities, how to use them and why to use them, and then we will put together a demo on the fly. Before I get started, I have here, I've actually posted on the orchestration site on the community. There's actually two articles that go with this. There's a part 3 article that should be coming out in the next couple days. That covers kind of these same topics a little bit more in depth. So you can see those there. And we'll be kind of following along with those today. And then the other thing I wanted to mention before we start is I'm going to be demoing this off of my developer instance, which is running Fuji. So you will see the UI is going to look a little bit different. It's our new UI that's coming out in Fuji. Everything should work the same, no matter, even all the way back as far as Aspen. Functionally, this stuff hasn't changed in a long time. It's just going to look a little bit different. All right, so let's get started. First thing I want to talk about is, and this is covered here in the first article, is how workflow and approvals work together. Approvals were around before the workflow engine ever became a part of the product. And so really, it's two different things happening here. And the way workflow works with approvals is very, very simple. And if you've read these articles, you probably are really sick of hearing this. But basically, workflow has a couple activities that do two things. They create approval records, and then they look at those approval records, and they make a final decision of whether this thing is approved or rejected. Those two jobs are basically the whole key to this integration. And if you read the articles, you're going to see it mentioned over and over and over. And the point of that is that you really got to think about it that way. I got two jobs. Job 1, create approval records. Job 2, make a final decision. And when you go to troubleshoot, that should really help you as far as figuring out what's going wrong with your workflow. So I have here a little diagram in the first article, and what it's showing you is that as the workflow transitions into the approval activity, we go into job 1, create some approval records. The 4 different approval activities give you a couple different ways to identify what users need to get approvals, and we'll look at those a little bit later, but basically the concept here is you need to, when you configure the activity, you're going to be telling the activity, create approvals for these users. After that job is done, the workflow goes into a wait state. The activity goes into a wait state. It's done. It does nothing else until something else wakes it back up. And that's kind of what's being signified here. We can't go on to job 2 until some other thing tells the workflow, hey, your approval states have changed. You need to take a look at them and see if you can make a final decision on them. So once that happens, then we get into job 2, which is, depending on how you've configured the activity, and we'll look at that again later, can I make a final decision about whether to approve or reject this thing that I'm being asked to approve? And that final decision depends on a couple different things. Depending on how you've configured the activity, you might be wanting a unanimous decision. You might be wanting the first person. You might have some custom logic for what's considered approved or rejected. But the point is, once the workflow is told about these changes to its approval states, then it takes a look at all of them, it evaluates all of them. If it's able to make that final decision, it takes the approver reject transition, and that activity is done. If it can't make a final decision, it goes back into the wait state, and it'll sit there forever until some other event outside of workflow wakes it back up and says, take another look, there's been more changes. From a troubleshooting perspective, this is kind of important because you basically want to, if you're having problems with your approval activity, first thing you want to look at is go to the approval tables and look at the approval records that were generated. And are they there? Did you get the approval records that you expected to get based on how you configured the activity? If you did, that first job worked fine. No problems there. Then the next piece that you want to look for is a little bit more difficult. You need to turn on the log. Basically, what we want to know is the workflow being notified about those approval events or not? And the way to find that out is if you go into the workflow properties, I'm going to pull up my browser, my instance here. And if you look in workflow properties, and you turn on these debug messages, the workflow debug messages, and the workflow approval actions, and the user approval activity. Sorry, it's actually, I think, I would turn on both of them. Okay. What that's going to do is it's in the context log for the workflow instance that's running. It's going to dump a bunch of information in there, and you'll be able to see whether your workflow is being told about the changes on its approvals or not. I have actually a context from a test I ran this morning, and I can show you what that looks like. If you go into the workflow log here, workflow log tab, and we're getting a bunch of debugging information in here. And the one we're looking for is, you'll see these events determine approval state. You'll see, so this is events coming in from backend and waking the workflow up and saying, look at your approvals and see if you can make a final determination about whether this thing's approved or rejected. You'll also see, like, this is coming from a group approval thing, a group approval activity, and it's basically just logging some information saying there was 3 total approvals in this group, and 2 of them are still in state requested, 1 of them's in state approved. So just looking at this, you can tell, oh, my workflow is getting those events, and so if I'm not getting out of that, if I'm not transitioning out of that approval activity, then the problem is probably in how I've configured the activity or in my approval script, if you wrote a custom approval script. If you're not seeing these events in the log, then the problem is that whatever's supposed to be notifying the workflow of these changes isn't doing it. Now, out of the box, that's done by business rules on the sysapproval approver and sysapproval group tables. Out of the box, that should work fine, but a lot of people customize those business rules. They try and add different states to them, and that's where things go south on them. So you want to look for those events. If you're not getting them, check your business rules. Or if you design some other notification mechanism, check that mechanism, because it's not telling the workflow to wake up. Okay, now let's talk about the approval activities. And when I say approval activities, I'm going to go into the workflow editor here. And I have a little test flow, which is nothing right now, but I'll show you how I created it. And I guess before I do that, I should mention, along with these articles, there's an update set that goes with each one. And the main thing that it does is it installs this approvals test table, which we can take a quick look at. This is just basically a dummy table, a table that I created just for the purpose of writing these workflows so that no other business rules would affect it and no other workflows would affect it, and we just have a very clean, simple way to do that. So you can install the update set and get this test table if you want, if you're trying to follow along and build it yourself. But that's the table that I'm using to write my workflows on. It extends task, which is important for these approval activities, and the second article kind of explains why. But other than that, it strictly extends tasks. I didn't add any other columns or anything, so it's very easy to recreate. Just create a new table, extend task, and you're done. All right, so let's go back to the editor. So I have my test workflow here. It's on my test table, and that's all. Everything else is just default. All right, now when I talk about the approval activities, if you look at in the editor, there's a category called approvals, and there's actually 7 activities in there, and you might have plus or minus a couple depending on which version you're running. But the 4 that I'm really, when I say approval activities, the 4 that I mean are approval group, approval user, approval coordinator, and manual approvals. These are the 4 that work on that same basic concept of create some approvals and then determine a final approval reject state. That's the sole job of those 4 activities. The other ones in there, approval action, generate, and rollback to, they're important for approvals. They're approval related, but they don't have to do with creating approvals and making a final disposition of approvals. So we're not going to talk about those today. First up, the simplest and probably the most useful activity is approval user. So I'm going to open that up, and the point of approval user is to give individual users a single vote on a single approve reject decision. So with approval user, what you're going to be doing is you're going to identify the users that are going to get approvals, and then the activity is going to take all of those individual decisions, and it's going to create a single approve reject decision out of it. The way you identify the users that are going to get approvals is through this users field. You got a couple of different ways you can do that, right? You can, if you click that lock, you can just type in a user down here in the picker. I can give myself an approval. So now I will get an approval on this thing that we're approving. You can also, through the tree picker, you can walk the current record of the workflow. And so like I could give an approval to the assigned to user on our current record. So now the assigned to and I will get approvals on this. You can also, through the groups field, you can pick a group. So I could say the database group. So every person in the database group will get an individual vote on this approval. You can also script who those users are going to be. If you click on the Advanced tab, you can write custom script to whatever custom logic you need to select who gets an approval on this thing. You add it into the array of sysids, and they will get generated an approval. Now, with approval user, every person in this list, it's unique people. So if I happen to be the assigned to, or if I happen to be in the database group, I'm not going to get 2 votes. The activity is smart enough to recognize that, and it limits you to 1 vote per user. Okay? So that's how you identify the users that are going to get approvals. Now, how is that voting tabulated? Well, that depends on the wait for and the when anyone rejects fields. There's a couple different options in here. Right now, by default, we're on anyone to approve. That basically means the first person to approve it out of, if I approve it, if the assigned to approves it, or if anybody in the database group approves it, this thing's going to be approved. When anyone rejects, it's going to go same thing. It will automatically reject it on the first person to reject. And there's a couple different options in here. Wait for everyone to approve would mean basically this needs to be a unanimous decision. Every single one of us has to approve it. First response from anyone is the first person to either approve or reject will automatically, basically does it for everybody, every user that's been selected. So whoever responds first wins. You notice when I did that, these two fields kind of work together, right? Because some of these don't make sense. Some of these options are mutually exclusive. So like first response from anyone basically means I'm waiting for the first response, whether it's approve or reject. So there's no point in having that the second option there. You basically already selected this. When anyone reject the approval. It does make sense in some cases, like everyone to approve, wait for other responses before deciding. With this combination, what you'd basically be saying is, I want to give everybody a chance to vote. It needs to be a unanimous approval, but I still want to know, let's say there's 10 people that got selected for approval between these three options. So there's 7 people or 8 people in the database group, and then the 2 of us up here. Okay. I need all 10 of them to approve in order to approve this thing. But I don't want to just immediately reject when I get my first rejection. I want all of them to vote. So I want to know 8 out of the 10 approved, but 2 of them rejected, or 9 out of the 10 rejected, and only 1 of them approved. So there's different combinations of these two fields that will give you different logic for getting out of this approval activity. And then finally, if none of those meet your needs, you've always got the condition based on script option, which basically lets you write oops, where'd it go? There it is. And your custom approval script. So you can create custom logic. You can vote, a percentage of approvals. You could have logic that said, everybody needs to approve unless one of them happens to be Fred Luddy, and then it's automatically approved. You can code up whatever custom logic you'd like for making this final decision on the activity. So once that decision is made, oops, what's going to come out of that, I'm just going to submit that, is either approved or rejected. So you get 2 transitions out of the activity. So based on the configuration that you've selected, the activity is going to decide this approval was approved or this approval was rejected, and you're going to have 2 transitions coming out of there. The activity will wait until it can make that decision, and then once it can, it transitions out, and it's done. So that's approval user. Now let's take a look at approval group. The difference between approval group and approval user is if approval user is for individual users to get a single vote on a single approval reject decision, then approval group is about groups getting a single vote on a single approval reject decision. The difference here is, how does a group vote? And the way we've decided to implement a group voting is that every member of the group votes, and then depending on how you've configured the activity, that's aggregated up into the group's decision. So this is very similar to approval user. You still have the groups option here where you can walk your current record. So I could pick, I want an approval to go to my assignment, whoever the assignment group is on this record, or I could just put groups in. So it's very similar to approval user. And then, again, very similar to approval user, we have different wait for and when anyone rejects logic choices. The difference here is that these choices are applied at the group level. So what I'm saying here is I'm going to have a group approval for my assignment group, and I'm going to have a group approval for my database group. And I'm waiting for both of those groups to make their decision. Now the way that group makes the decision, you have some other options in here that aren't available in approval user. For instance, here, this is saying is I need, not only do I need each group to make a decision, but I need everyone in that group to make a decision. So each group's voting has to be unanimous, as opposed to just the first person from any group, from a group voting. So with this option, the first person to vote in a group votes for the group. With this option, everybody in the group has to vote. So you've got some different options. Similar to approval user, these will kind of hide and oh, I thought one would hide the wait for. There it goes. So when you have a mutually exclusive kind of a situation, the UI should hide the choices that don't make any sense. Otherwise, you can mix and match to get the logic you want. And again, you can code up your own custom exit conditions however you'd like. And just like with approval user, where if a user was specified multiple times, they still only get one vote. With approval group, if a group is specified multiple times, they only get one vote. So if the assignment group on this record happened to be database, it would still only generate one approval for the database group. They wouldn't have to vote twice. And that is basically the approval group activity. And our third one that I want to talk about here is manual approvals. Now, manual approvals still work on the same two-job concept. They just don't do job one. So what manual approval lets you do is let users of the system, through the user interface, go into a record and manually add themselves as an approver, or manually add somebody else as an approver. So it's good for cases where it's kind of like one-off logic, where automating a script to hit those conditions when this guy needs to approve something doesn't make sense. It just doesn't happen often enough, or it's too complicated, or you just don't have the data that you need, and basically, a human being needs to just look at it and say, oh, we need to get Joe's approval on this. What manual approvals is really about is giving you the options, those same options on the exit conditions. So you can still come in here and you can pick, I've got, this is how I want to make my final decision on those manual approvals that people have added to my record. So it just gives you the same capabilities as approval user and approval group, and actually manual approvals works with either group or user approvals. But human beings add the approvals manually as opposed to the activity doing it automatically. And then we have the approval coordinator is our final activity to talk about. Now, approval coordinator, again, works on the same basic concept, but it delegates to child activities to do its jobs for it. So I'm going to skip right past this screen for now and show you what it looks like on the canvas. So basically, approval coordinator is just another approval activity, but instead of being focused on user approvals or group approvals or manual approvals, it can do any of them. So if you want to create approvals for a user, then you add a new child activity to approval user, and it will basically delegate to that activity and say, you go off and do your thing, and you make your decision based on how you've been configured. And when you're done and you've made your decision, that's what I'm going to base my decision on. So you can add different child activities into your coordinator, and when they've gotten their final answer, the coordinator will make its final decision based on those child activities' answers. And then approval coordinator has kind of the same wait for and when a rejection occurs choices for choosing the exit logic options that all the other activities have. Okay, so now that's all 4 activities, and I'm going to build up a quick demo here. I'm going to use approval coordinator. If you followed along with if you've read the articles, this is going to look a little bit familiar. I'm basically going to combine all of them into one approval coordinator controlled approval scenario. And the idea here is, let's say we've got our WF approval test records. Lost my mouse cursor here. There we go. Okay, so we have our test records, and these are, let's just pretend they're tasks or changes or something that needs to be approved. And they need to be approved by the person that they're assigned to, and they need to be approved by 3 groups that are going to do the work that we're talking about here, and those 3 groups are going to be database, network, and hardware, and I'm just using out-of-the-box stuff, so you should be able to reproduce it on your system. And then finally, we're going to allow people to manually add approvals. I'm calling those the busybodies. They just happened to look at this record and decided that they wanted to have a say in whether it was approved or not. So I'm going to build up that example. The way I'm going to do that is with Approval Coordinator. I'll create first we have our individual user approval, and that's going to be for our assigned to user. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm giving it the name assigned to just to make it simple to see. And I'm going to say, go to my current record, and whoever that record is assigned to, they get an approval. Now, with only one user, these don't really make much difference, so we can just accept the defaults. And there you see, inside my Approval Coordinator, I have a child approval user activity for the assigned to user. And I'm going to do the same thing for Approval Group. So these are my implementers, the people that are going to make my change. They all get a vote too. And that's going to be based on 3 groups. We got guys from the database group, guys from the network group, and people from the hardware group. Okay, those 3 groups have to approve this change as well. And in this case, I want an approval from each group. So I'm just going to take the defaults on those 2. So basically, I want at least one person from every single one of these groups to approve this change. And then I'm going to add a manual approval activity, and I'm going to call this the busybodies. And with these people, I'm going to say if they cared enough to put their name on this thing, then they have to vote. So I want all people who have approvals on this thing to vote. And I think when anyone rejects, we'll reject it. That's fine. Okay, so now my Approval Coordinator activity is basically going to have to wait for the results of these 3 to finish before it can progress. And I'm just going to add a couple transitions here. And then let's try it out. So to try it out, I'll add a new approval test record, and I'm going to assign it to, I'm going to do Savannah. I know in the article I did Fred. I'm going to pick Savannah because I know for a fact that she isn't in any of those 3 groups, so it'll make it a little bit easier to see the individual approvals. And then we're going to submit it. So you can see I have a new record here. I'm actually going to just go ahead and delete that one just so we're not getting confused. This is the one I just created. And if we look at our workflow context, we have a currently executing workflow context. This is the one from the log I showed you earlier, and I can get rid of that now. Okay, so when we look at our workflow, what we see is it has walked into the Approval Coordinator activity. Approval Coordinator delegated out to its 2 approval user and approval group activities, and it's waiting on the responses for those. Now, manual approvals, there's no manual approvals at this point, and that's an important thing to keep in mind with manual approvals. Unless something makes your workflow wait, I guess before we say that, all of these approval activities will auto-approve if there are no pending approvals for it. So if this approval user activity, if we hadn't assigned anybody in the assigned to field, it would consider that an auto-approval. If there's no pending requested approvals, it's approved. Same thing with group. If there was nobody in those 3 groups that I picked, or I didn't pick any groups, that's an approve, and the activity will continue. It'll keep on trucking right on out the approved transition. It's done. And manual approvals is kind of doing that right now because I haven't added any manually. It can't, it's the Approval Coordinator is still holding the workflow up here, but manual approvals is basically done. It's decided I'm approved at this point. Nobody's asked for a manual approval, so you got an approve vote from me. And now let's go look at our record, and we'll see in here I got 3 group approvals. Okay, and I have 16 individual approvals. And what those are is we should see one for Savannah, because she was the assigned to user. That's from my approval user record. And then I see a bunch of what appear to be duplicates for different people. And like here, Fred has 3. And what that is Fred happens to be in all 3 of these groups. So he got an individual approval vote for network, one for hardware, and one for database. And we can see that if I go in here and approve one for him. I don't know which one it is. But now when we go back and look at the group approval, that was from the network. That was the approval from the network group. So the network group has now voted. This group approval is approved. And if we look back at this list, you see a bunch of these are no longer required because Fred voted, and that group has voted. So all of those people that were in, was it network? They don't need to vote anymore. And now I would like to add a manual approval. So let's say I'm a nosy guy. I happen to see this going on, and I want to get my 2 cents in on it. So I'm going to add myself as a manual approver. And we should see me in the list here. Now notice this says not yet requested. With manual approvals, you don't get all the bells and whistles of the automated workflow activity. So you actually have to go in here and change the state to requested. This is kind of the difference I was talking about between workflow and the approval engine. The approval engine is kind of just records, and there's nothing to say change this to a requested state. Workflow kind of manages those states for you, and it says, oh, I'm ready now, I need to request these approvals. So they were automatically set to that. But if I do set this to requested, and then I go back to my workflow context, now my manual approvals is also waiting. It knows it's got a manual approval sitting there, and that needs to be cleared before it can make its decision. All right, so let's just finish this off. I'm going to approve it as myself. And then I'm going to do an approval. I'm going to approve Savannah's. And then I'm going to go in and have Fred approve the other 2 as well. So these are his other group approvals. And you can kind of see by the record, we got a bunch of approvals and we got a bunch of stuff that's no longer required. All of our groups have approved. You would expect this activity to now be finished. And in fact, if we go back and we refresh, you can see it did finish. We took the approved transition, nobody rejected, and the approval coordinator is now done. All right, so that's our demo. And I think we're a little bit over time, but I'm going to take a look at the Q&A and see if we had any questions come in. I don't see any on the Hangout. And back to here. I need to refresh the screen. And we do have a question. You mentioned that approvals are a separate platform capability that are often mistaken to be a component of workflow. Approvals make most sense as part of an overall process. When and how might you use approvals outside of a workflow? So there was a simpler approval engine in the product originally before workflow came along. I guess my answer to your question as a workflow developer is I think most of the time it does make sense to use it as part of a workflow. But there was a time before workflow existed when there was a very simple approval engine, and you could essentially make rules that said, and this only worked on task tables, and it's still in the product today, actually. If my task, or any table that extends tasks, meets these conditions, create an approval record for these people. And kind of the same thing happened where those approval records would be resolved, and then business rules would wake up, and the engine would make a decision. You just had a little bit less flexibility as far as how it worked. So the problem with that is, A, it was very simple. B, it only worked on the task table. And I think that pretty much today the recommendation is, if you want to do approvals, do it as part of a workflow. I'm not sure that I have a good use case for doing it outside of a workflow, unless you're sure that you have a very, very simple process and you just want a very, very simple mechanism. And I'll type that up and reply in the discussion thread also. All right. I did have one more question that came in from email. Oh, looks like actually I just got another live one. Why are group approvals only available for tasks? Okay, so that's actually what the second blog article was about. So this one's about kind of the basics of how approvals and workflows work together. And then, oh geez, how do I get back there? This one is about task versus non-task approvals. And the short answer is approvals existed before workflow, and in the very beginning, pretty much people thought the only thing you would ever want to approve is a task, or that everything that you'd want to approve could be considered a task. And so there was approvals and tasks were tied together, were coupled together pretty tightly. And approvals only understood how to work on tasks. And then, it didn't take long before we figured out that that wasn't a very good way to do it. That was kind of short-sighted, and people wanted to approve stuff that was not tasks. And so approval user and workflow were used to enable that capability, but none of the other activities were ever updated to do it, basically. And this article kind of explains the details of why that is, or of what the difference is between the two. So I'd suggest you take a look in there, and hopefully that'll explain it. And then I had another question that came in from email last night. This was actually from our training group, who is building some sort of an approval process internally. We actually use our own product quite a bit to run the company. And the question was basically, how do I create an approval? We talked about the different options in the wait for. And I said, you can have the first person to votes for the group, or every person in the group has to vote unanimously. But what this person wanted was to see, how do I get like a 50%? If 50% of the people vote, that's considered an approval. And it actually isn't too difficult. You have in the script capability, in the script field, you have these counts. Actually, I can probably pull this up. I've closed my. Let me open up my test flow. And I'm just going to go ahead and use one of these guys. If you look in the script field, if you pick wait for condition based on script, we give you a little API that will give you the total number of votes, the number that have been approved, the number that have been rejected, the number that are still pending. And then there's a couple other states that are a little more exotic. But in this case, all you need is a fairly simple script. And I actually responded to this last night, so I can cut and paste it in here and show it to you. Okay, so basically we want to create a little function that says, well, count up my votes, you know, calculate a percentage that I've approved, and then set a final state. The answer that we need to send back to the activity here is either approved, rejected, or requested. If it's requested, the workflow activity will go back to sleep and it'll wait for more events to come in, and it'll run through this logic again when those events do come in to see if it can make an approved or rejected decision. And so that's kind of how you could do a simple, voting percentage kind of a mechanism. This has actually come up on the community a couple times, and so I think I might try and do a little more involved example with it and post it up there. Now, the other thing that was kind of interesting about this question was the original way it was worded is that she has two groups here, and she wanted two different kind of approval logics on them. One was basically if anybody in this group, in the hard-coded CAB approval group, I get a single person approves, that's an approval. But in this group, I need to have a 50% voting approval. And my response to Karen was that's really the way I would do this is not with an approval group activity at all. I would use approval coordinator. What you have here is two different approval logics on two different sets of users, and they're independent of each other. And yes, they're ANDed together. We needed a decision on both to make that final decision, but if you try and do it with a single approval group activity, you're going to have a bunch of complex logic in that script. And this is pretty simple to do with an approval group. This is straight up just an approval user. Just pick the CAB approval group as in your approval user activity, and everybody in CAB approval will get an individual vote. The first person to vote, or the first person to give an approval, will cause it to go through, and that's exactly the behavior that you want, right? So that's one condition of my coordinator approving. And then this one is fairly simple to do with approval user also. You just select this expression as a dynamic group, and then you use the little script that I sent and showed you guys, and that's going to give you that group voting on a 50% approval vote. And then approval coordinator will automatically take those two child approvals and their conditions together, or depending on the logic you've picked. In this case, we want them to AND them together. We need both of these guys to approve, and then handle the transition for you. So that's how I would handle that situation. And let's check for conditions one more time. And that looks like it on the questions. Okay, so like I said, check out these two articles. They're in the orchestration area on the community. I'm going to post part 3 this week. And if you have any other questions, you can reply to the articles. You can reply to this. We're going to keep this open, and send me your. Oh, one more thing. So some of my I know my examples are simple. I want the hard scenarios. I would like to wrap part 4 of this Seeking Approval series. I would like to be difficult or challenging approval scenarios that you're struggling with, and we'll try and do, like this is our recommended way to solve that problem, and just do like a whole post on different scenarios and the solutions for them. So send those in to me, and I'll talk to you next month. Thanks.